Welcome to New York Bio's Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Beth Tuck, Executive Director at GenSpace.
Beth Tuck, it's wonderful to have you here. We are going to learn a little bit about GenSpace. We are going to talk all about kind of the evolution of education. We're going to fix a bunch of problems, and we're going to talk about community labs. So we usually tend to start with a bit of an origin story. So why don't you tell everybody a little bit about how you got where you are and a little bit about GenSpace, and we'll dive in.
Yeah, so I can talk about this for a long time because I think origin stories are really important, but I'll try to keep it brief. I am born and raised in West Virginia. I'm Appalachian. And I, growing up, wasn't really exposed to that much science. There was science around me, but it wasn't like very clear that this was a thing that I could do. And so it wasn't until I got to college and I had my first like biology class when my professor was like, this is a thing that you are capable of. And also it just kind of opened up this world for me. It was like a whole new way of knowing and understanding the world that I didn't know. I didn't know about genes. I didn't know about evolution. I didn't know about so many things that like are so critical to our understanding of our planet and our ways of doing medicine and our thinking about sustainability. And like all that was new to me as a, an 18-year-old off to school for the first time. So I decided then to like pursue science wholeheartedly, got really excited about doing research and learning new things and discovering new things. But when I was doing research, I also started to understand the ways in which words are hard. Equitable access to education is a barrier for so many people getting into this field. It's not just me, it's so many people along the way that either get shut out on purpose or turned off because the classes are boring or because the content doesn't feel relevant to their lives or because of systemic issues. They don't get access to hands-on science experiences at a young age, or whatever the reasons might be. There are so many barriers for people to get into science and then to succeed in science. And then what that does then is stifle the innovation capacity for science, right? And so
Sure.
that became kind of the driving motivator for me to get into science education and community engagement work, which I've been doing for the last decade.
Yeah. Right. So again, I think equitable access to education and equitable access to science is really, it's difficult without at least one cup of coffee under your belt. That's actually really, really hard. So so we're going to wind the clock back, but before we do that, why don't you give us a little bit of an introduction to GenSpace? Tell us what it is, tell us where it is, and then we'll go from there.
So GenSpace is a community science lab. I'm virtually there. We're located in South Brooklyn in a neighborhood called Sunset Park, which is close to Industry City for anybody who's aware of the area. And it is a remarkable little place. It is walking into GenSpace feels like anything else that I've ever experienced as a scientist, as a learner, as an educator. It's a different kind of environment, and it's so special. I can't like start to describe it enough.
You can tell us. It's okay.
It is a community science lab, which means that we have a fully functional biotech laboratory space where anybody can use it. So you don't have to be in a PhD program. You don't have to be starting a business. You don't have to be, a certain type of person to be able to come into this space. You get to bring whoever you are, whatever interests you have, whatever curiosities you have, whatever knowledges you have into this space to ask questions and create things that mean something to you. And that is very different from my experience in science and different from most people's experience with science. And we do that for all ages, all backgrounds. We have youth programs, we have programs for seniors and retired people. It's all across the spectrum for opportunities for people to learn science and to actually do it themselves in a community space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, my wife is a scientist, and I've been to her lab several times, but it's not like I can go in and kind of mess around with the lenses on the microscopes or anything like that. It's underappreciated, as they say. So if we are gonna, let's pause on GenSpace for a second, because I want to actually go through how you got there, right? So you actually had started off, you did science as an undergrad, and then you basically had this really interesting turn through kind of multiple levels of scientific education. So why don't you walk us through that a little bit, because you've done undergrads, you've done high school, you've actually done programs at kind of the national level within the NIH. So why don't we wind through a little bit of that? Because I think there's a lot of value in there for, like you said, thinking about equitable access to science and thinking about really where the next generation of scientists are going to come from.
Yeah. Yeah, so I also did my graduate work at Washington University in St. Louis. And so
Hmm.
that's where I really got my feet wet with doing science education. I had been doing education in a lot of different capacities before, like volunteer and working in summer camps, and always kind of had that flavor to my work that there was a need for like making learning more fun, more enjoyable, more accessible. So that's
Hmm.
always kind of a thread, but it wasn't until I was in graduate school that I started doing it with a science lens. And so, yeah, so in grad school, I started volunteering. We were doing youth outreach. We were working at schools, doing hands-on science activities, science fairs, you know, and I worked a bit with a teacher professional development program there, supporting teachers who are actually getting summer research experiences, things like that.
Hmm.
And from there, then again, I got to transition to do it professionally. So I started working at the St. Louis Science Center and doing hands-on science, informal ed for a wide variety of audiences. I got to run my own little neuroscience research team there, and we got to
Hmm.
take apart gadgets and gizmos and try to understand how do things work. And doing that in a community-focused way. And then the other piece of that work was really about community development. So we got to work a lot with community partners, other nonprofit
Hmm.
organizations, to try to understand what their science education needs were, how we could best support their students, and how we could build capacity in those organizations to be able to do better science education in their own spaces. So I worked at the Science Center, and then I also was adjunct teaching at a university. So I was teaching a bio lab for mainly pre-health students. And then after that, I started working at a private high school in Columbus, Ohio called the Wellington School. I loved the
Hmm.
school so deeply. It was a wonderful place to learn how to be a teacher and to learn how to think about teaching and learning in a very different way than I had come up through the education system. We were working
Right.
on really innovative teaching methods and project-based learning and all sorts of cool things.
What were some of the things that it did differently, right? So what are some of the things that, you know, there's dogma and there's kind of the way that everyone does it. What are some of the things that they did differently? And one of the things that I want to explore here is, what are some of kind of the things that, you know, we do them because it's the way that we've always done them,
Yeah.
and what are some of the effects of that on, you know, kind of the way we get this pool of scientists, you know, this pool of scientists to progress and to graduate and to have advanced degrees in science. Because as we were talking before, you know, one of the big challenges now is, how do we get the makeup of that pool to be representative of everyone?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it hasn't been for a long time.
Yeah, I think some of the core things that came up for me. So the school was founded by entrepreneurs, and so they had a
Mhm.
kind of a flavor of like, let's do things differently from the get-go, and that made it to be a very experimental space to try things in education that maybe were not commonly implemented in public schools. And so some of those things were like flipping grading. Grading is like every teacher's nightmare. I hate it. It stinks, but you have to do it, right? Because you have to like have some way of understanding whether your students are learning. But what we swapped to in our school was a method called standards-based grading. And so instead of or mastery-based learning, so instead of grading like, did they get an answer correct on a quiz, we're really gauging like, do they understand this deep concept and can they retain it over time? So it was a
Mhm.
very different approach to understanding assessment. That was one of the big like takeaways for me. And then the other
Mhm.
like, critical one was like, it was so much more open to hands-on. And that to me was a pretty transformative educational tactic shift. I got
Yeah.
away from kind of teaching lecture-based, and we got really into either hands-on or discussion-based. And so that's kind of been a core principle for my education philosophy like, going forward. And it does transform the way that the learning environment is shaped, the way that people engage, the curiosity that people bring. It's different when people are doing things.
Yeah, I think there's also, I would hope that there's also a little bit more recognition of the fact that people learn differently, right?
Yes.
I think for the longest time, school was school, and you basically followed the rules, you did whatever anybody told you to. But now we know a heck of a lot more about how people pay attention, how people learn, and we realize that not everybody fits in the same box. And you know, it's a real challenge, because when you have things where you need either standardized test scores or you need some way of assessing the large body of people, it's difficult to not have those things be done in a consistent and standard way. So you set up this dichotomy of, how do we do what's best for the learner
Mhm.
versus how do we actually monitor things on the back end? And I don't know what the solution is there. I think the deeper you get into education, the answer seems to be is that it's hard.
Yes. And it's labor intensive. I think that's one of the big things that maybe goes underappreciated is how much work it involves to do it well and to really make sure that the learning environment is healthy for all learners.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially, I think, anybody who's a parent will immediately gravitate to this, but like when you try to actually teach someone something, you actually get an understanding of the fact that this is actually a much more complicated and difficult thing than you probably ever appreciated before. So one of the things that I'll ask, I think this is important for a lot of different reasons. So if we think about, you had said you work with underserved youth as well. So there are actually a lot of leaders across the spectrum. Ken Frazier of Merck is a standout here. You say that because of one educational opportunity, they would not have broken into biopharma and science. Ken Frazier has the story that it was either a TED talk or it was on YouTube. It was something like that, where he talks about this program that he was like lucky to get into on the last day, where he would get on a bus and basically go to the best school in Philadelphia every day because it was an exchange science program. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of the aspects of working with communities that we actually really don't appreciate the lower level of resources that they work with. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because ideally, I'd like to talk about, is it actually getting any better? Yeah. And can we talk about some of the examples of things that genuinely would work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry, that's a major compound question I just threw at you, but
yeah. Let me try to unpack it a little bit. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about our experience working with youth from underserved communities, or sometimes we phrase it as youth from historically excluded backgrounds, because again, it's not necessarily that they just got that way, but on accident, that there were systems and structural choices that people made to create the conditions in which they are not participating at the same levels as other populations. Right. I'm certainly happy to talk about that, and I can also kind of talk more broadly about the general field, because we are one very small ship in this like giant ocean of boats, right? There are a lot of really great people who are doing this work. I'm really proud of the work that we're doing at GenSpace to engage young people and like give them space to live out their potential. Right? They are extremely bright and thoughtful and creative and innovative thinkers, and they're very they're very thoughtful, and they are motivated, and they just haven't had the good fortune of the opportunities that other people have had in their lives, right? And so fundamentally what we think about is like we think a lot about a strengths-based approach. We really think a lot about like what are the knowledges, skills, expertise that they're bringing from their lived experience, and how can we leverage that to be able to create really interesting, innovative science experiences for them. To both like it's a kind of a bridge building exercise of like helping them understand science culture, helping them understand academic culture, but also really like embracing youth culture and making sure that they have a space where they get to be who they are. And it's that kind of learning environment that I think is the most critical, that it's affirming for their identities, as well as helping them build knowledge, skills, and like confidence for their future.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what you said is really important, because there's a lot of self-confidence that goes into science. I think there are people that intuitively think they quote unquote can't do it. You also have kind of the stereotype that quote unquote the smart kids do science, right? I think there's a lot of loaded language and expectations around who gets to be a scientist or who is a scientist that I think can probably be, scary or intimidating for people that aren't used to it or haven't done it before.
Yeah, that's a core piece of like what we're trying to do at GenSpace, is like break down those stereotypes, level the playing field, and embrace the fact that people are coming into science with knowledges and skills that are valuable and precious and that we need in science to make our science better. And so it's artists and designers and architects and engineers and youth and retirees and grannies and stay-at-home moms. They have something to offer, right? They have something to offer for science. They have knowledge, they have wisdom, they have experience. And like, it is so important that understanding of what they bring to the table matters. And that's a really core piece of what we're trying to achieve at GenSpace.
Okay, so how did GenSpace start?
Yeah, so I wasn't here in the early days. So I'm always still kind of trying to pick up the full story. But my understanding is that a group of nerds, self-proclaimed nerds, a journalist, a biotechnologist, an artist, a few other
nerds. Gotcha.
Yeah. They saw the biotech revolution coming. They knew it was coming, and they saw it kind of following a similar vein as the IT revolution, kind of the computer science world opening up, technology world opening up. And they said, we want to get ahead of this. We want to create a space where anybody can, right? And so they got together in Dan Greshkin's living room. Ellen Jorgensen launched her TED Talk, and like magic happens, right? So they set up the first lab in downtown Brooklyn, and then in 2017 moved to Sunset Park. And then I joined the team in 2018. So it's been kind of an evolution of the organization, an evolution of leadership, and we're still kind of learning and growing every day, and embracing a learning culture at our team.
So what did they do first? What was the first foothold that they kind of had? Because you've expanded, right? I imagine you couldn't do everything coming out of the box.
That's right. I think the early days were really focused on individual projects. So there were a couple of like really major success stories that came out of the lab, including OpenTron. So we're here in New York City. OpenTron's and recently just set up the pandemic response lab, which has been
we know them well.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. Good. So OpenTron's actually got its start at GenSpace. The founders met initially on a chat room, but then came to the lab to actually set up their first prototypes, and they launched their Kickstarter out of GenSpace, and we were their home for their first years. And so, again, that's an example of a type of project where the convening power of a space like GenSpace to bring people together from different backgrounds was our superpower, is our superpower, right? And then the other kind of example of a really like keystone project from the early days was Heather Dewey Hagwork, who's an artist. And she was working on this project called Stranger Visions, where she went around New York City collecting discarded objects and hair and coffee cups and chewing gum, extracting DNA from those objects, running it through a program that she built, and 3D printing people's faces to go along with those objects. And so this project really opened up a lot of really rich conversations about biotechnology, ethics, privacy, identity, how can we do these things in a way that really benefits society rather than, continuing to reinforce societal inequalities. So that was those were some examples of projects that people did in the lab that were really profound and impactful. And since then we've set up new things like running premium memberships, which allow small businesses to have low-cost access to startup space. Like if they're not quite ready to using those angel investors, they have a lower cost option to come and test out their IP with us. We've launched community projects, which are group research teams. And I can tell you a little bit more about those. We've launched a youth internship. Dan, who's also one of the co-founders of GenSpace, also launched the BioDesign Challenge, which is a mainly university level design competition for people to innovate with biotechnology in interesting ways. So there's a lot of really great stories that have come out of this lab that we are really proud of, the impact that we've made in the larger community bio and biotech ecosystem here.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You're touching a lot of areas of the community that, basically outside of, and some inside, but really at the fringes of where academia doesn't necessarily touch, right? They don't do it that way because that's kind of not the way that it works. And that's, it leaves opportunity for, I would say, different kinds of engagement with the community. So I think we can, honestly, we can take a lot of those things, and I'm interested to explore a few different ways that you work with the community. But what I'll start with though is, OpenTrons is a great story. And for those in the audience that don't know, OpenTrons effectively started by making, redesignable robots and easily deployable robots for automation, right? Instead of buying a $400,000 TCAN instrument, or they used to be $400,000. I don't know how much they are now. You actually could, put together what now is called an OT2 that does effectively the same thing for much, much, much less. And, that's brilliant because it's really kind of this confluence of hardware and market opportunity that doesn't always necessarily, it's not, there's engineering involved with it, but it's not really the type of engineering that, the NSF wouldn't fund it, right? It has not broken any scientific barriers to get there. It's really kind of smarter application of technology for something they thought there would actually be a marketable need to address, right? How do we make robots more accessible? How do we make this easier for companies to develop and to implement, so you don't have to have these massive style budgets to put this infrastructure together? And those are the kind of things that I think fit well into the space. So let me ask you, how do people tend to get involved, and what are some of the major, the major reasons that people get involved? So so do you have do you have a membership model? Do you have to kind of sign up as a member to come access the space? Is that the way it works?
Yeah, we have a few
Okay.
different ways that people can kind of get involved. One is like by just taking a class. So if you're not sure that you want to commit to like doing your own science project and like starting a company, you just want to like test the waters. So we have classes and workshops where people can learn really fundamental skills, everything from like how to do CRISPR and basic synthetic biology types of experiments, to things like bioinformatics and data science, to things like bioart and design. And so we have a full spectrum of ways in which people can kind of like get their feet wet and learn if this is something that they really want to spend some time doing. And then often from there, people will transition to a membership. And we have membership based, it's a monthly fee, and you get 24/7 access to the lab, including some basic consumables and basic supplies. And then again, like there's multiple ways in which people can get involved in the membership program. We have small business, individual projects, and community members. And then beyond that, of course, there's volunteering, there's, teaching with us, there's, engaging with our youth interns, there's mentorship, there's a lot of different ways that people get involved. But membership is the core way in which you can like pursue a project at GenSpace and create something in the lab. Yeah.
Right. So how do you as a lab stay ahead of some of those things? Because I imagine, when Jennifer Doudna's CRISPR paper gets published, it's not like the next week you can set up a CRISPR function, right? And you can't, I imagine, Chris Mason kind of needs his sequencing infrastructure to be able to sequence the subway. People just can't walk in with a bunch of swabs from the one train and say, I've like done all these things on the subway, I would like to sequence this, please. So what are some of the ways that you try to stay ahead from, we'll call it an infrastructure standpoint, right? How do you kind of stay ahead so that if someone walks in the door and says, I would like to do these things, you say, oh, well, we actually have the capabilities to do that?
Yeah, so I think there's two answers to that. One is around like just staying in tune with the literature and staying in touch with like what's going on here in New York City, especially like knowing the Chris Masons and the Harris Longs and the other folks who are doing really exciting, innovative work. And the other is around just like continuing to like assess and understand what we have and what we need. And so we've been thinking a lot about like where could our lab grow? What else do we need? And we're hopefully soon going to be able to have a big announcement about new sequencing capabilities in our lab. So we will actually.
You don't want to announce it now? Go ahead, announce it now.
Very soon. So stay tuned. But yeah, we're going to be doing some next generation sequencing here at the lab, and again, like building out our capabilities of both like learning how to work the machines, how to analyze the data, and how to really make interesting discoveries. So it is something that we're just constantly thinking about and like sussing out what are the new technologies coming to market, how can we really make sure that we're building out the infrastructure that people need to learn how to use them and to actually make things with them. So everything from gene synthesis to new cloning methods to alternative ways of doing protein purification. A lot of it comes down to, like you said, like with the OpenTrons story, is like how do we make this thing that academic labs have extra cash. They're able to do things in certain ways with certain vendors. How can we hack those protocols and maybe make them a little bit more affordable? And so that origin story of OpenTrons is really true to the ethos of GenSpace, is how can we hack our protocols to make them more accessible?
Yeah. So how much of what you do is kind of expectation setting, right? So I was going to say, like, if I walked in tomorrow and said, I kind of, I watched HBO last night and I would really like to CRISPR some wings onto this lizard that I found. I'm going to make this dragon. There's got to be some portion of you that says, okay, well, why don't we take a step back and let's talk a little bit about science and how things work. Like, I appreciate your enthusiasm. It may not work that way. How much of your day is kind of expectation setting around really, again, kind of educating people on what's possible, and then almost imparting a little bit of scientific method of perhaps you may want to start back at this part of the timeline rather than trying to create a dragon in a community lab, which opens several other questions. But
Yeah, that is really accurate. Like I would say it's a pretty substantial part, and not just among youth. It's also grown-ups who come through and want to like.
Oh, I didn't mean it
Yeah,
from a
yeah,
youth
absolutely.
question. Nope.
Yeah,
I think the
yeah.
adults are probably harder.
Spectrum, it really like managing expectations is like a core thing that we'll talk about. But I think one of the things though, that I'll push back on that is yes, there's a lot of like informing people and helping them understand what is and what isn't feasible and what is and isn't addressable with scientific methods. There's also other methods that people might use, artistic methods, philosophical methods, or other kinds of approaches to understanding things, right? But for me, as a scientist, when I get posed those kinds of questions, like how can I CRISPR wings on my lizard, what I start to do is start to unpack the assumptions that I make coming from a science lens of what is and what isn't possible. And it's really like that clash of like wild imagination plus practical science that makes it such an enriching place to learn and play and create. And like it's often those kinds of prompts that force me to look beyond um like, oh, so maybe that isn't possible, but what is, right? And so it forces
Right.
me to rethink the question, and that I think is a really profound like shift in the way that again, like science and art and design and technology and all of these fields kind of clash, intersect, and feed each other. And that again, that environment doesn't happen in a traditional like academic space. You don't get that kind of like very wildly divergent idea set coming together.
Mm-hmm.
And so I definitely appreciate the expectation setting, the science literacy bits, but also like it forces me as a scientist to rethink what's possible.
Well, that's really interesting because it's funny. Again, we swing back to education, where a
Yeah.
lot of times you think about about education as imparting knowledge, but a lot of times you know you kind of need to be a little malleable in the way that you think about things, right? And people don't necessarily take this to heart all that much, but honestly, when you think about the way that when you think about the thing that you're trying to tell someone, you think about why you're trying to teach them that way, and think about why it actually is. When you force yourself to think about those things, it actually, again, it makes it a little bit more challenging to be that open-minded, but also you kind of get to a better level of truth.
Yeah.
So we can talk a little bit about so let's talk a little bit about the makeup of the community, right? Because you have, like you said, you have a number of different programs, whether they're educational programs, whether they're art programs, whether there's design competitions, which I love, by the way. I want to actually talk about this. And then there's the actual kind of use of the community lab. So if you were to kind of split things into buckets, right? How much of your time would you say is spent on kind of curating the folks who are using this as a community lab, and how many educational programs do you run kind of throughout the year? What's your split, if you can kind of give us kind of the buckets of Gen Space?
Yeah, so our buckets are like four-ish buckets. We have our youth initiatives. So we have our internship program, but we also have a youth volunteer committee that does education outreach in the neighborhood. And we have alumni internships and other bits and bobs. So youth initiatives kind of one bucket. And those are usually long-term experiences. So we work with our students over the course of 6 months or even several years for the alumni. So it tends to be a fairly small cohort of youth, anywhere from like 15 to 40 in any given year.
And where do they come from? Where do you get them? What ages are we talking about?
Yeah, these are high school students, and we recruit heavily from Title I schools. So those are low resource schools, and especially focused on Brooklyn schools. Although we do accept students from all over the city, but we try to recruit from Brooklyn just because it's easier for them to get to us. We're a little bit off the beaten path. So that's our youth development programming, and again, those are really aimed at college and career readiness. Leadership development, youth development, really building out their skills and their confidence to be able to take that next step as they go into college and pursue STEM careers. That's kind of one bucket. Our adult education programs are our classes and workshops. Those we run about like 60, 70 classes or workshops a year.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Yeah. We usually serve at least like, I would say probably like 600, 700 people in any given year. So just through our courses and workshops. And again, those are, like I said, those are everything from like, biotech basics to, growing your own kombucha paper to, dyeing textiles with bacteria and everything in between. So those are ways, again, for people to learn science in a hands-on way in a really fun, friendly, enjoyable environment. And then they can kind of choose, what do they do next? Do they take it back to their artistic practice, to their scientific studies to their entrepreneurial endeavors, whatever, like wherever it will lead them next. And then our membership program is our third bucket. So this, again, we have right now around like 48, 50 members of the lab. And they are bucketed into a couple different categories. Some of them are starting businesses. Some of them are just pursuing their own like interest hobby projects. And some of them are working together on these group projects, these community projects. And then the final bucket of program, and I'm happy to like go into a little bit more detail.
We can go there.
Yeah. And then the final bucket is like our more general like education, outreach, community, public programming type of thing. So we'll do everything from like going to the Brooklyn Bridge Kite Festival and flying kites and collecting microbes from the sky and kind of helping people understand that microbes are all around us, to bacteria art and painting with bacteria. We'll do this summer, actually, we got to collaborate with another nonprofit in our neighborhood called Uprose, to do an air quality monitoring citizen science initiative. So they were actually like, taking a little sensor all over the neighborhood to understand like what's going on with our air and how does that impact our health and other aspects of social justice and racial justice, environmental justice. So things like that. So it's a really like broad spectrum of things that we get to do to engage the public in hands-on science in a slightly more like impromptu or less structured kind of format.
Yeah, just in case the last 2.5 years hasn't been evidence enough for everybody, yes, microbes are in fact all around us and they are in the air.
Yes.
Just as a public service announcement, if you haven't gotten that one yet, they are. We can go to GenSpace or you can kind of just look around. So okay, let's the thing that I would ask you next is so let's delve in on a couple of these, and I would ask that as we've seen this uptick in businesses getting started in New York, biotech has been on this incredible upswing, everywhere, and in particular in New York City, right? Have you seen a similar rise in kind of folks that are coming in from the startup aspect of things? Because I'm interested because I think a lot of the new venture creation that we hear about is mainly straight out of academia, published scientists, et cetera, and you get a lot more kind of molecule development things, which I imagine GenSpace is not terribly well set up for. However, with that comes, other kinds of entrepreneurship, whether they're devices, et cetera. So can you talk a little bit about whether you've seen a little bit of that upswing and kind of what kinds of groups you see coming in and what kinds of things that they're able to access?
Yeah, I'm going to pull up a document while I do this because I want to make sure that I'm being accurate from my data. But yes, we've definitely seen an uptick in interest. I think where we sit is a little bit different from other incubator or startup spaces in that we're even earlier stage. So we're at such a level, like they're not even ready to necessarily form a business when they start at GenSpace. Sometimes they'll grow one as they go, but oftentimes they're coming in just to like tinker and explore, and the business will emerge. So yeah, the way that we see it happen the most. We've served at least like 4 or 5 startups in the last year that have used the space as kind of a launch pad for them to grow their IP and to grow into a new space. They do, like you said, they do tend to follow a different path than the traditional academics. We're not getting very much biopharma. We're more getting things in the consumer biotech space, which I think is a very exciting and growing field. And so there are things like you mentioned, like lab equipment. There are a few that do biopharma diagnostics and therapeutics. There's a few that have been focused on like environmental remediation and trying to think about how can we engineer microbes that can clean up pollutants in our local ecosystems. And there's been a lot in the consumer products. So there's things like fashion, personal care, cleaning products. We've had a CBD company come through. So like there's a lot of stuff coming up in those spaces that I think is more, again, like representative of the kind of environment that we have at the lab, which is not kind of in that traditional biomed pharma space. Yeah. It's really about the convergence of arts, design, technology, and biotech.
It's a much bigger sector than anybody, well, I don't know that anybody gives it credit for, but than most people think about, right? You tend to think about these molecular breakthroughs and the $100 million A rounds and things, but like you said, I think consumer biotech is really interesting. I think with the emergence of indie bio in New York, I think this is a particular strength of theirs. And listen, we want to foster all of these applications, because there's lots of different ways for this kind of science to make an impact, and there's no one, there's no one dogmatic way that this is exactly what a biotech company should look like.
Yeah, we're really excited. One of our like favorite biotech companies that's come out of the lab is actually joining NewYorkBIOs cohort. So we're really
excellent. Which one?
It's Vader Nanotechnologies. Trayvon Gordon is the founder, and so
okay.
Yeah, really
what do they do?
They're doing environmental remediation. They're trying to clean up PFAS or some of these forever chemicals using directed evolution. Yeah.
Yes, making forever chemicals into no more chemicals is actually a very, very good thing.
That's right.
So I still remember when they were dredging I think the PVCs or whatever it is out of the Hudson. Yep. So we should stop that, and hopefully I hope they take off. I think there's a ton of innovation there. I think dovetailing that with kind of climate change and other sorts of environmental challenges is a real place where biotechnology can make an impact.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right. So why don't we shift a little bit? Let's talk a little bit about your design competition, which I'm really excited about. I think this is something that, when you mention design, I think a lot of people kind of think when you mention design, I think people probably think about making a prototype and all sorts of those things. But, when you start to delve into design thinking, you think a lot more about really thinking about the problem and thinking about all of the sorts of things that you are designing for, much more so than, here, let's go get in the lab and build something. So there are a couple of these around now. I think design as a field is getting bigger, and it's something that I think is great training for just about anybody thinking about any sort of problem solving. So can you tell us a little bit about your design competition? Like, where did it come from? When is it? Who applies? And how does it work?
Yeah, so I should rephrase that. So the Biodesign Challenge started at GenSpace, but it's since grown so fast that it became its own organization. So we're not.
Oh my gosh, a success story! How about that?
Yeah, so it's another great success story of something starting at GenSpace and then growing so much bigger, and that's the appropriate place for it to grow, right? It's into something new. But the challenge is really cool. It runs every year in June, and so it's an opportunity if anybody's around. They've been broadcasting it for the last couple of years. You can check out their website. Biodesign Challenge, and it's a great opportunity for people to see what young people are thinking about and imagining with biodesign. At GenSpace, the way that we lean into the biodesign focus is more through our community projects, and then we also see it individual designers. So our community projects, we have a couple that I think feed into this design space thinking, which one of them is the Engineered Matters Lab, which is led by Jasmine Neal. And she and her team are organizing a synthetic biology approach to making spider silk, fermenting spider silk, to make as a replacement for consumer products. And then the other is our biomaterials club, and they're really interested in just kind of exploring all aspects of sustainable, renewable biomaterials, things that we could use to replace basically every aspect of plastic in our lives. So there's a couple of places where specific groups of people are interested in working together to design our way out of some of our big global challenges.
Yeah. So did you say there are actual design classes and things too? Do you work? Are these predominantly youth-based, youth-focused classes? Who takes them? When are they? How do you get involved?
No, these are all programs for grown-ups. So any of you who are listening, please come and hang with us. We run anywhere from 1 to 2 to 3 biodesign-oriented workshops each month. Just this last weekend, we had 2. We had one where people were designing textile prints using bacteria dyes, and another where they were designing mushroom-based furnitures. In this case, we were designing this really beautiful mirror using mushroom roots. So there's a big mushroom.
Hold on, we're gonna mushroom-based furniture.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. So hold on here. I'm gonna actually put GenSpace's website into the chat here. I want to make sure that everybody has access to the website and can actually check out some of these things as we're talking, because honestly, the more that you mention these things, it's like, oh, that sounds really good, and I want to make sure that everyone can actually find these and figure out. Okay, so talk to me about mushroom-based furniture, and this is not a fictional character sitting on a toadstool in a fairy tale. This is an actual thing that. Okay, so yeah. What kinds of furniture? How many? So talk to me a little bit about mushroom-based furniture. And this was not in the pre-notes. Like, I did not think we were going to mushroom-based furniture, but here we are.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a growing movement. The world at large seems to be really enthralled with mushrooms these days, and so people are getting more interested in them for a lot of different reasons. But their material qualities are one of them. They if you grow them in particular, what's really great about them is they will grow to whatever shape you mold them to, right? So as long as you can design the right mold and you just like kind of let them do their thing, they will make whatever product you want them to make. With like the limitations of working with living things, there's always something that really goes a little bit wrong. But they're great materials. They're heat resistant, water resistant. They are sound absorbing. Like, it's a really cool material, and it's pretty strong. And I think I'm gonna get the time and date wrong, but I think it was the architect Phil Ross who built this like wild tower of mycelium bricks outside of MoMA PS1 a few years ago, probably 2012-ish, something like that. And so the company Ecovative is the one that we kind of have worked with most closely. They are up in Troy, New York. So again, part of this like larger New York City burgeoning scene, or larger New York burgeoning scene. And yeah, they've been working with mushroom roots. Mycelium is the science word for it, to make all sorts of different things. You can make these physical objects, these materials, but you can also use it to make like leather. You can use it to make food. You can use it to make all sorts of different things. And again, like what we need is space for people to like experiment with those kinds of technologies and to innovate more, because they see new opportunities, again, often drawing from their lived expertise or their lived experience. And so again, that's a space where like GenSpace can come into play, is you can get introduced to these materials and start actually like working with them, learning how they grow and seeing what they're capable of doing.
Yeah. You've mentioned a couple times overlaps with the art community, which I think is really interesting, because there are so many kind of creative expressions through science. Do you find a big overlap with I mean, there's a huge artistic community in New York, and you actually mentioned upstate as well, which has had a long history of terrific art. So do you see a lot of confluence of that, and how do you cater to that, really, because it's a very different thing than really kind of a purely educational aspect. There's a level of creativity there that kind of harkens back to what you said before, which is like, well, how could we reimagine this, rather than not like kind of telling someone how they can do it, thinking about the why and how that fits in. So how do you kind of cater to that community, which I every time I see a new twist on science as art, I think of the amount of creativity that goes into it. It's super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's so much fun to work with the artists in our community. They ask the wildest questions. They imagine the zaniest applications. Like, it's a treat. And they're also asking really like thoughtful, provocative questions about how and when and why we should use this technology, or when we shouldn't. Which again, for me as a scientist who cares deeply about ethics and ethical uses of emerging biotech, like those kinds of questions, the ways in which they're able to like story tell and engage audiences through artistic media is a very different way of just me being like, let's care about the ethics of a thing, right? And so the way the engagement, the participation is very different when you work with artists. So in terms of how we engage them, I think like a lot of it comes down to institutional culture. Like, what is the environment like? How welcoming is it? How can people walk through the doors and feel comfortable and confident that like their pre-existing knowledge is respected and welcomed, and not just respected and welcomed, but like wanted, right? Like, it is a space where they're really important, critical parts of our ecology. And that's true to GenSpace's origin story. So one of the founders is Narit Bar-Shai, and he's an artist and was one of the core founders of the lab. So art has always been a kind of a identity of the space.
So can you talk a little bit about as you talk about this, it sounds you reach in so many different directions. What kind of staff do you have that supports all of these things? And I don't know how many of you, I don't know how many Beths there are, but it sounds like it would take at least 3 or 4 of you to do everything that you're talking about here. You run an immense number of programs. As we've done this webinar every week for the last 2.5 years, and that in and of itself is a Herculean task. And you're talking about so many things that happen multiple times a week that it's blowing my mind.
Yeah, it's hard, but I am very lucky that I have an incredible team. I have 3 other full-time teammates, and then 2 new artists who just started working with us thanks to a grant from the Creators Rebuild New York. So they've been able to kind of start to step up our community engagement programs and our integrated art science practice. So that's been really nice to have the Carolyn Hall and Florinda Backlow joining our team. And then my core team is Leila Hernandez, who's our education manager, Giovanni Lopez, who's our lab manager, and Vanessa Fleury, who's our development and comms person. And the three of them just really do bring so much creativity, talent, thoughtfulness to the approach. So I'm really lucky. I'm very lucky that I don't have to do this alone and that I have a team of really wonderful people to get to imagine and create with. And then beyond that, we have like a very, very wonderful engaged community of members, of volunteers, of instructors. You know, there's even though our immediate orbit is quite small, our extended family of people who make GenSpace work is big, and it's lovely and creative and imaginative and thoughtful, and it's a treat to get to work with all these people.
Yep.
Yeah.
So as New York kind of continues to grow and evolve, right? How do you find that you dig into the community and get your reach into the places that you want to be, right? Getting people to Sunset Park is obviously one way, and you know it's again, it's a corner of Brooklyn. It's out by Biobat a little bit, right? How do you kind of balance the we want to be out in the community versus we want to bring the community to us?
Yeah. Yes. So I think we just we just try to think about the whole picture, right? We try to think about like, who are we serving, who's in our space, who are we missing, and you know, again, we back in 2019, I think maybe it was 2020. I can't remember. No, it must have been 2019. We went through a kind of an organizational reshuffle, and we sat down and really thought about like, who are we now that, you know, all of the founders had moved on to new endeavors. We had a new team. We really needed to do some kind of soul searching as an organization and really understand like, what are we about? And so we set a new strategic plan, we set new mission, vision, values, and we started to kind of use that as our guiding anchor for how we make decisions about what organizations we want to collaborate with and what communities we want to serve and what kinds of programs we want to develop. So that's really been a kind of a guiding anchor for us.
So you went through all of that in 2019, and then 2020 rolls around and COVID hits.
Yeah.
And basically you throw that plan away, and then I imagine it's like, well, okay, we had this strategic plan. Now how much of it can we do via Zoom?
That's right. That's exactly what happened. Like, to our community's credence, right? Like they stepped up, and we ended up getting like participation from all over the globe, and people were really excited and engaged to spend 3 or 4 hours on a Zoom on a Saturday. Like it was a treat. It was so much fun to work with learners from all over. And they, you know, many of them had said like, oh, we really want to come to GenSpace, but you only do things in New York, right? So that, you know, people had been waiting for this kind of opportunity in some ways, like to be able to participate and be engaged. And so that was really fun. In spite of the tremendous difficulties and challenges that we faced, both like personally and organizationally, like it was a tough time, but like that was the silver lining of this very
So how much stuff are you actually able to do online? I mean, I know that, my kids know, you know, the YouTube accounts like the Physics Girl, you know, Diana Cowan and folks like this that actually do, you know, really kind of interesting stuff like that. Do you find that do you use that medium a lot to get some of your stuff out there? Because there are kind of basic, you know, there are basic things that you can do in your kitchen that are really interesting and a good intro to this. So do you use that at all as a bit of a hook or a bit of an intro to get people interested?
Yeah, not much right now, honestly, because we're very place-based. We really believe in like the hands-on aspect of it, and there's a lot of already existing content on YouTube that can teach people how to do the chemistry. So you know, we don't really want to like recreate that material. We want to really focus on like what we do best, which is like giving people a really rich hands-on experience and getting people access to experts. And I think that's one of the other pieces that is really special about our learning environment is like, you let's say you are an architect, you want to learn about using biology in your, you know, building materials. You come to the lab, you meet like a professional microbiologist, and they can talk to you about microbes in the built environment. Or you meet, you know, a postdoc who's working on, you know, novel nanomaterials, and you're like, ooh, maybe I could use that in a building or in a concrete or whatever. Like, and so it's this opportunity to meet people that, again, is like our strength is that convening power. So we just try to lean into that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you see yourself doing more of that? So we're in the last kind of 10 minutes here. And usually for the last 10 minutes, we like to talk about the future and the things that you the things that you see coming down the pipe and the things that you'd like to do next. So for the next little bit, let's talk a little bit about where you'd like to see GenSpace go in the next, say, 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, so then in the immediate future, like my super big dream is like we need more physical space. Our lab is very cute, but it's very small. So like our physical capacity to both like add new equipment and advance our scientific capabilities, as well as like serve more people, is really limited by our physical space. And that's been a bit of a challenge. So we're hoping to be able to grow into a larger lab and be able to serve more people in the more immediate future. In the longer run, like my grand vision is like to be a bit more purposefully networked with other spaces in New York, and to be able to like set up satellites and do hands-on activities and authentic research experiences in other places, especially as like the biotech scene is continuing to grow in this like very fast wave of exciting activity. We want to make sure that we are staying at the front line of creating really welcoming learning experiences for people who aren't coming from traditional academic paths.
Right.
So kind of our core, and then especially like thinking about youth development. And so thinking about satellites and opportunities to build out. And then the other piece of it is like GenSpace is part of a growing global network of community labs. And so it would be nice to think about like, where are those labs popping up, who's running them, how are things going at those spaces, but also where are the gaps. So I'm from West Virginia. I care a lot about Appalachia. I know that educational experiences are not there in the way that they are in big cities. And so thinking about, like, what are ways that we could continue to support the like growing global ecosystem of these types of labs, and really thinking about what can we do to better provide frameworks and support for people to start and sustain these kinds of labs in their local environments.
Yeah, you almost have to pick the range of your vision, right? How much do you want to be local? How much do you want to be, really global? How much do you want to, how much can you push outside of the walls that you have now? And honestly, there's a lot that comes with that, which is, how do you staff up for it? How do you, taking your time away from one thing is putting your time into something else. And how do you kind of water all the plants that need watering? So where does your outside of memberships, which I imagine you're a membership-based organization, right? So outside of memberships, where does your funding come from?
Yeah, our classes and workshops are also paid for workshops. So that's another source of our funding. And so between our earned income usually brings in somewhere between like 30 to 40% of our annual budget. So it's actually pretty substantial, which again is important for us thinking about sustainability and making sure that we can continue our staff year over year. But the other major streams are kind of traditional nonprofit routes, which is grant funding and individual giving, corporate sponsorships, and things like that. We've been really lucky for the past, I think 5, maybe 6 years to have support from the Pinkerton Foundation, which has been supporting our youth initiatives, and just recently got additional funding from Brooklyn Community Foundation for youth development and youth initiatives. So that's been great. We've had longstanding support now, I think 3 or 4 years, from the Siegel Family Endowment. They have been incredible supporters of us. We're incredibly grateful for all of their guidance, leadership, and support. And then we have new corporate relationships. So we just were supported by a company called NewYorkBIOs, which is an eye therapeutics company, and they have been tremendous. Like, we absolutely adore this team. They've been huge supporters of us and really, really exciting. And again, starting soon, we'll have another announcement about a new corporate partnership coming up. Yeah. So,
you can break news on here. It's perfectly okay to tell us what these things are.
Yeah. So yeah, we've had a lot of wonderful support over the years from different grant funders. They've really been really helpful for keeping us going, and especially during the pandemic when we really needed to rapidly pivot. They were really flexible. It's just been a treat to get to work with them. And of course, I can't thank the individual donors enough as well. We really do rely a lot on grassroots support and people who love GenSpace and care about GenSpace and want to see it thrive. They're the heart and soul of this place. So thank you.
Yeah. Yes, we can't. I guess we can't list them here. I kind of picked the credits. If we were technically savvy, I could have the credits and people scrolling down the left hand side, but we're not. So I mean, we think a lot about the evolution of New York in a lot of different ways, and it's really good to see an organization like yours growing and thriving. Because one of the things that we do and we think about is we do think about where the next generation of scientists are going to come from. And I think it's important for a lot of people to recognize that a lot of this starts with kids, and a lot of this starts with education. So just kind of winding back to really where we started. right? And so do you have the kind of participation broadly across the city that you'd like, or is there anything that you think you'd like to see grow, right? I know you said that you have a lot of focus locally in Brooklyn, but honestly, this really seems like something that kids from basically every single corner of the 5 boroughs would really benefit from.
Yeah, yeah. Again, in my grand dream, like we would do more for, and there would be a Gen Space in every neighborhood, right? Like, because I do believe in the power of this technology to change people's lives, and I believe in the power of community spaces to create the environment in which people can innovate and can imagine and can create and develop things that actually matter to them. So, like, yes, let's do it. Yeah. Yeah.
So what's it like trying to think about, so we have only a few minutes left, so I'll do this one and then we'll kind of open it up right at the end. So what is it like trying to think about, and I missed a question here. Okay. So one of the questions were, and I'm sorry I didn't get to these before, this was actually really early. So what recommendations would you have for other community biology labs trying to start up across the country? So you don't have to enable your competition here in New York, but what suggestions would you have for other places in and around the country?
Yeah, I have a long list. So
yeah, I bet.
The easiest way actually to answer that question is shoot me an email. And what we have in the back end a few years ago, Gen Space, I think it was like 2014, I don't remember exactly when, they set up this website called the Open Lab Blueprint, and they have kind of a set of questions and provocations and prompts for you to think about as you might be setting up your own lab, or just like infrastructure that you might need to consider before diving in. And so I can send you the link to that resource, and then we can also just like have a chat and chat about kind of lessons learned.
Is this the iGEM? Here it is.
Yes, yeah, you found it. Okay,
We've
great.
got it. We've got it. Google is a wonderful thing.
Yeah,
Google is a wonderful thing.
Is a little defunct, but we have all the content on the back end.
Yeah. So just kind of building on that question, I think one of the things that's come out over and over again here is that a lot of your growth and a lot of your success has been due to, organic growth in the community, right? It seems like a good piece of advice might be to really, it almost seems like you start with one thing, but really pay attention to what your community needs and where the gaps are. Because honestly, it seems like you and your team have done an amazing job of finding new things to do, finding places that the community, really has an appetite for this, and really kind of having the bravery and the boldness to go there. Yeah. Right. I think one of the things that's not, I don't know if everyone appreciates this, but the programs that you have, like they didn't exist before. They weren't guaranteed to succeed, and you kind of have to continue blazing new paths, which is incredibly difficult.
Yes. Yes, yeah. But again, it's the community that keeps us going. So thank you all to you who participate. I know I see a few familiar names, so I hope you know who you are, but thank you.
Yeah. You're in a really good space. So, okay, so we have a minute left. Why don't you give us your final 30 seconds on the, really what you've seen in terms of the evolution of New York and where you think things could go in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've said it. Like, New York is really at this like important cusp, right? Like, there's been a lot of investment, a lot of innovation, a lot of development. It's coming, and we're at this point where we really need to be purposeful and intentional about who is getting to innovate, who is supported, who's representing the interests of New York City, and making sure that we really do spend the time and the energy and the resources to support a more diverse, equitable, inclusive future in life sciences. It's just too important. And when people get left out of the conversation, the technology isn't there then to enable really true transformational change in our lives and our globe. And we have too many big challenges between climate change and social unrest and all of these other things that we need everybody's brains at the table, right? It is important that we have a kind of a space where we have like the option for the most creative, innovative ideas, and we can't do that unless we address the systemic inequities that exist in our education systems and in our pathways into life sciences careers.
Yeah. Well, listen, Beth, it was wonderful to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us. I think this was great.